I have a Minolta MD Celtic 135mm f3.5 lens here that I'm going to be disassembling. This lens is one of the Minolta Celtic line, and the Celtic line generally used cheaper components and cheaper coatings and other things on the glass to reduce the cost. And I found that this lens in particular, compared to even the later MD lenses, it's really not repairable. The copy I have here had some fungus on the inside of the glass elements, and I was not able to find any way to, because of how the lens is constructed, how to actually access the inside of the elements and clean those off. And there are just a lot of other annoying points as well. The design is extremely simple though, so it would be easy to repair if there are any problems with that. The mechanical design it's very similar to the later MD lenses, and this is kind of the direction that Minolta was going into the 80s with the cheaper designs and other things, which is a little disappointing when you compare it to the earlier lenses. What I'm going to be doing is actually disassembling, getting the optics separate from the mechanical sections and the body sections as much as possible. Again, because of how this lens is designed, that's not always really possible. Mechanical sections are so simple and connected in so many ways to the body sections that it's not really possible to separate them. First off, let me mention one thing on this lens that kind of tripped me up originally. There are these three screws going around here, little slotted screws with the built-in lens hood that goes over them, going around this section. And unlike the 200mm Minolta, you don't want to undo these screws at this stage. These actually are holding in the diaphragm. So if you undo them while the lens is still fully assembled, the diaphragm, all the aperture blades will end up falling out of the lens, and you'll have to reassemble that, which is no fun. So you should only undo these if you actually want to take apart the diaphragm and clean the blades individually. I'll start on the front of the lens and go in from the front to get access to the front of the diaphragm. You can see the name ring going around here. It has 4 little divots for a spanning wrench, but you need one with pointed tips, and you can also use a screwdriver to undo this. So I'll undo the name ring, and what's kind of interesting here is that the name ring is also the only component that's holding anything in the front in place, whereas most of the other Minolta lenses I've taken apart have the name ring and then there's the optics screwed into something else. In this case, the optics are just loosely in the lens, so once I take off the name ring, they just tip right out like that. So that's definitely the first indication that this is a much cheaper design overall. They're trying to cut down on the components. And that gets us access to the diaphragm right away on the front. So you can see the aperture blades down here and the diaphragm on the front of the lens. Next up, I'll get access to the back of the diaphragm as well. And like some of the other Minolta telephoto lenses, this is a little bit more involved than with the normal length lenses. So to get access to the back of the diaphragm, I'm going to have to remove this back optical piece, and that requires me to remove the back mounting plate here. So I'm going to remove this I think it's a plastic mounting plate. It has these 4 screws going around here, and just lift off this entire mounting plate. So this comes off and reveals how simple the actual mechanical parts of this lens are. Here's the aperture control curve. It's just built right into the aperture control ring, not like a lot of the other Minolta lenses where it's attached to the diaphragm or even its own separate component down here. And then on the back section here, this is the bar that's actually controlling the diaphragm. It's hitting this little lever in here which opens and closes the aperture. And this is the stop-down lever, directly controls this little bar back here, and then the aperture control curve, it moves along this little post here moves along this curve and opens and closes the diaphragm as well. So just a very simple design on this lens. Next up, I have the aperture control ring here, which I'll just lift off. There's a little ball bearing over here in this section where the grooves are near the aperture control curve, so I'll be careful not to lose that. So there's the ball bearing. It was just resting actually on the aperture control ring here in this little pocket down there. So I'll set these aside for a second. And now looking at the back of the lens, Here's actually the part that I damaged trying to take the lens apart. This back element had a lot of fungus on the inside, and later when I remove this, I'll show actually what's going on, but these two kind of grooves over here, those did not exist originally. I kind of cut them into the lens in an attempt to get into the back element here. So on a normal lens, this is a complete circle of plastic there. Next off, I'm going to remove the actual back, this back glass piece fully so that I can get access to the back of the diaphragm. So it's attached down inside the lens by 3 little screws down here on top of a silver ring. So it's a little hard to see and they're pretty far down inside the lens, but this will remove the back optics from the lens. Now I can just lift out the entire back optical piece, and it has this separate silver ring that it was sitting on that you can remove. It had the 3 screws in it. So that silver ring and the back optical piece. I'll set aside the lens body for a second and just talk about both of the optical pieces here and why I don't consider this lens particularly repairable. A lot of the other lenses have the individual elements are held in place by different rings and other things, and those typically have little slots for a spanning wrench that you can go in. Maybe they use adhesive to hold them in place, but you can dissolve the adhesive and actually go in and remove those. On this lens, and what that actually allows you to do is clean inside the lens. So inside, if there's not just fungus on the outside here, there's actually fungus inside. Not on the outer surfaces inside one of these elements, the back or the front, then you can clean inside. So that's a very repairable lens, because even if there is fungus, you can attempt to clean it out. In this lens, these optical pieces to me seem like they're a solid piece of plastic, and I wasn't able to find a good way to actually undo either of them. Both of them, neither of them has little slots for a spanning wrench. It looks to me like the top glass here is either glued into place, and I tried to dissolve it using adhesive using alcohol first, and that did not work. And then it looks also like there's a plastic ring going around here that's actually part of this body section that's sitting on top of the back, the first element. So that's why I tried to go in from the side here and lift that off, but even breaking the lens in this way, I wasn't able to do it, and I was afraid that I was actually going to end up cracking the entire back element completely if I tried any more, because I was really, I was already fracturing little pieces off on this side. So I pretty much wrecked the lens trying to repair it, but it already had fungus inside, so it was not usable as it was. So that's just a really annoying design decision, and it's just, it's the reason I don't consider this lens particularly repairable. You can repair other elements of this lens, but not the optics, like you can with a lot of the other Minolta lenses. Now I'm going to actually remove the section with the diaphragm, and unfortunately the diaphragm is kind of built into one part of the inner part of the focusing mechanism. It's all one piece, like on the MD 135mm. And that's a really annoying feature, because it really limits how well you can clean the diaphragm without actually taking apart the diaphragm and cleaning the individual blades. But I will remove the piece that is as much as possible. So it is held in place by these 2 bars on either side here. This center section is held in place by the bars. So I want to loosen up these bars so that I can just slide out or unscrew the inner section here and remove that with the diaphragm. So I'm going to undo the 3 screws here and then on either side and remove the 2 bars. So with those 2 bars removed, I can now grab the top section of the lens here and unscrew the diaphragm mechanism from the lens completely, like that. And as I was mentioning before, the diaphragm and the diaphragm piece itself, which is way actually down here inside the lens after this piece, after the lens hood, and the intersection of the focusing mechanism are coupled together. This is a single long tube that they're in. The only way that you can really successfully get the diaphragm on its own is by undoing these three little screws I pointed out at the beginning. And once you undo those, the diaphragm will probably fall apart and you'll have to put it back together, but that does allow you to clean it on its own. So otherwise, this is as isolated as it can really get. So I'm just going to... And finally, one more piece on this disassembly. Unfortunately, you can't really... this lens operates a little bit differently in how the focusing ring is attaching here. So you can't really successfully clean the focusing ring the same way. This is all one large piece right here where I'm focusing back and forth. But you can separate these two rings, and that does allow you to clean a little bit better, but still their components are so integrated that it's not quite the same as with like the MC rockers where you can really clean just the body section. So to separate these pieces, I'm going to undo this little screw right here, and this screw is actually what internally is providing the limits of how far back and forth you can go. So at either extreme, that little screw is hitting against a barrier to prevent it from going any further. So once I loosen this up, I should be able to remove this long slotted screw, set that aside, and now these sections in here I can just separate. And I'll remember I was at 1.5 when I took this apart. So I can I can unscrew these sections, they don't pull apart. So 1.5, and I'll turn this around to the right or left, and that removes these two rings, but they still have the focusing components integrated into them, which does limit how well you can clean them, in my opinion. So that is unfortunate because you cannot just easily, you have to be more careful when you're cleaning these body sections. So it is, with all the integrated components, you can definitely tell that they were trying to make it a simpler and cheaper design. So that's as far as I was able to take the disassembly. Unfortunately, like I mentioned, the optics cannot be any further disassembled any further, which is really the only limitation I hit up against on this particular lens. And also the diaphragm, you can take that apart and actually clean the aperture blades individually themselves, but I'm not going to do that in this case. It's very similar to the 135mm diaphragm, so reassembling it is almost the exact same procedure where you can take out the front plate here and the back plate and take out the entire diaphragm mechanism with all the blades, assemble it, clean all the blades, reassemble it outside the lens, and just slide that entire thing back up so that the post goes in here, hook up this little spring over on this side again, and you should be all set. So now I'll start on the reassembly, and the reassembly is also pretty simple. For this particular lens, just have to make sure that everything gets locked in the correct positions again. So starting with the focusing ring here, and this other ring with the depth of field scale and the inner part of the focusing ring, I'll start screwing these two together and just go as far as I can in this direction until I find where it stops. Okay, so it stops there. And what we want is for the little indicator here to be able to move back and forth between infinity and the minimum focusing distance, so 1.5 meters. And in this case, because I went this far, I went to the extreme and it's stopping midway here, so I have to go back one revolution so it can actually go to infinity in this case. And I also remember that I was at 1.5 when I took this off, so I'm just gonna put that back to 1.5 for now. So I'll lock these back together so that it stops at the two extremes by just putting this little stopper in place again with the slotted screw. And now when I rotate it, it should, the indicator, stop at 1.5 and at infinity properly. Next up, I have to get the diaphragm mechanism back into the lens. So I have to screw this section back in, and I kind of marked where I took it out, but in general you may have to play around a little bit to find the correct orientation to get this back in place properly. So here, let me go like that, but it is easier to reattach these sections than with the normal length lenses because the diaphragm mechanism is longer. Or the screws themselves, the screws in the focusing mechanism is longer, so it's easier to thread those two back together. So to reattach this fully, I'll put in one of these bars here, and before I do that, I want to check and make sure that when so in this case, I want to check and make sure that I can focus between the two extremes. And in this case, I seem to have messed up at some stage, because now with this bar just sitting loosely in place, I can't focus any further in. See, it's set to 1.5, which is the minimum focusing distance, so it should be set all the way out. But in this case, it's set all the way in, so it's focused at infinity. So let's see, we'll rotate the section here around and have to rethread this. And I'm going to thread this in as far as it will go on the back, and then rotate this back section around a little bit and retest. Just holding this in place should now go between the two extremes. A little bit hard to hold this in place and do that, but it does seem to be working properly now. So I'll reattach these two sections using the 3 little screws going on each side here and the 2 bars. Now I'll get back in the back optical piece, and this just has the little ring here that is what's actually doing the coupling, and sits on top of this section here. It's kind of like a large washer. Let me get this on first and line this up with the 3 screws going around here. And I find it's easier to actually install the screws on the outside of the lens and then screw this back together and tighten it down inside the lens, rather than trying to get the screws in place while the back optical piece is inside the lens. So I'll just get these screws in the right position. And now I can just lower this back into the lens. Orientation on this one doesn't matter. Next up, I'll get the aperture control ring back in place. The aperture control curve is going to sit over here in the longer gap on the back section here. So it's going to slide back and forth in here like this. And this little thing over here is actually limiting how far we can turn this. So you can see it hit back on either side. So that's limiting how far the aperture control ring can be turned. And the little ball bearing is going to sit inside the aperture control ring in the back section right near the curve right here. So it's going to be pressed up against the grooves on this side here. And I found what's easiest with this lens is to first get the aperture control ring in position. Then with the little ball bearing, just lift up the aperture control ring a little bit until you can see where, in this section over here, where it has to go, so the little slot for the ball bearing. And I'll kind of rotate this over so it's against the wall in a corner there. And then I can put the ball bearing in place, and using a slotted screwdriver, press up against the ball bearing so that it goes into the little slot where it has to go on the aperture control ring. Ready to retry that? And then just slide it down so that when I have the aperture control ring turning, you can hear that little clicking sound. Next, I'll reattach the mounting plate itself. And the mounting plate has 2 things that need to get lined up properly. This little post over here needs to go in this section over here in front of the aperture control curve. So this little post, so that it can move the lever over here up and down. And then this lever itself needs to get coupled onto this bar to actually hook up into the aperture. So those 2 should get lined up, and it's fairly easy to actually line it up in this case, because really you only have to get this one lined up and the post over here should pretty much line up on its own. So we'll start over here. And then line it up with the 4 screws going around here. Alright, so that has the back reassembly complete. Now on the front section here, the only thing I have to do is drop back in the front optical piece. Again, it's not really held in place, which is just awful, but so drop that in place. And then screw in the name ring, which is actually going to hold the front optical piece in place as well, and lock this down with a spanning wrench afterwards. Alright, so that has the reassembly complete. Make sure that the stop down lever, aperture control properly working, and focusing from infinity to the maximum focusing distance as well, or to the minimum focusing distance as well. So when it came out, the Minolta Celtic line was a lower cost line of lenses, and the way they achieved that was really reducing the quality of the construction. And that results in a lens that, in my opinion, is not very repairable. You can repair certain things on this lens, of course, like you can repair the diaphragm if it has oil on it, and mechanical components, but if you have problems like there's fungus or debris inside the optics here, to my knowledge, there's no way to get inside and actually clean inside the optics without damaging the lens, which kind of defeats the entire purpose. Repairs are also just going to be a little less rewarding on this lens as well, because it uses these lower quality parts, and it's a lower quality lens to begin with. So it doesn't give you the same ability to actually make repairs as something like the MC lenses do. The later MD lenses of this focal length, the telephoto lenses, they also went towards more of the Celtic design, which is unfortunate, like I said. But the MC lenses are, when you compare this lens with the MC rocker 135mm f3.5, that one is extremely repairable in comparison. Whereas this lens I found to be much more difficult, even though this one has a much simpler design.